Okay, thanks for clicking there for our conversation with Gisèle Huff. I'm Mike Hartmann. Dan Schmidt's the other guy, my longtime mentor from the Bradley Foundation. Gisèle Huff is the author of a new memoir entitled Force of Nature, interestingly enough, because she is in fact also a force of nature. We can maybe get to who came up with the idea for the title. She is also founder and president of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, about which we will also speak. And Dan and I know Gisèle from her time as executive director of the Jacqueline Hume Foundation, which had a shared program interest in education reform with the Bradley Foundation, where Dan and I worked. So we've known Gisèle a long time, and I've just told her we're going to have her back for volume 2 of the memoir in whatever it'll be, 10 to 15 years, Gisèle. And the first question is, Dan was wondering whether he's in your book.
No, not by name, not even, I don't even think I mentioned the Bradley Foundation.
Okay.
Because I did talk about that part of my career, of course, but it just so happens that I was hired in November of '98, and in January of '99, one of my trustees, George Hume, and I went to Milwaukee to talk to the Bradley Foundation, and I think I met you, Dan, at that time.
I believe you did.
I'm not sure, Mike, you were there, but that's when I met you.
Right.
In order, because I was brand new to the field, and they wanted me to get introduced to a foundation that was doing work that they were interested in doing as well. So
great.
I remember that it was very snowy. Very snowy.
Yeah. But Gisèle, let's start at the beginning, because the memoir is about your whole life, and we'll get to ed reform, I swear.
Okay.
So, and Dan and I talked about maybe who would ask which questions, and I got the tough one. Let's start with where were you born?
I was born in Paris, France.
Okay. And then tell us about your family, your parents and your family.
So, excuse me. My mother was born in Paris as well, and her parents escaped from a small town in Ukraine when my grandfather was going to be drafted in the Tsar's army during World War I, and so they were illegal immigrants to France. They settled in Paris. They had 2 children, my mother and her brother. My father's family, there were 5 children altogether. They were in Odessa, also in Ukraine, and they left in 22 because of the Bolshevik revolution. My grandfather was sort of a middle manager in a jam factory, so he was part of the people who were being persecuted, and they settled in Paris. They went to Turkey first. They settled in Paris, and their oldest son went on to America to reconnoiter, because my father was 17, but the youngest child was like around 5. So they waited to immigrate to the United States, but the McCarran Act closed the door, so they remained in Paris. So my mother and my father met, my mother being 8 years younger than he was, but both fantastic dancers. And they met in a dance hall, which was the place where young, blue collar people met in Paris in those years. They got married, and they had me 2 years later in 1936. And in 1940, France lost the war. And there's a blitzkrieg, happened, and the family was Jewish, so there started the nightmare. In 1941, when I was 5, my father and my uncle, my mother's brother, I actually was being taken care of by my grandparents while my parents worked. We lived in the same building. And my father and my uncle were taken in a raid on the street. in retribution for the killing of a German soldier. They were sent to a holding camp in Paris, near Paris, and then they were deported to Auschwitz, where they were both killed in 1942. In 1942, the Germans did the sweep to get rid of all the Jews who were foreign born, which is why my mother was not included. But all of the other members of the family and their children who were French born but weren't going to be left behind by their parents. Nobody knew what was going on. People, the story was that they were being repatriated to their country of origin. It was absolutely, of course, not true. They were being killed in concentration. And that happened to 18 members of my family, including my grandparents and everyone except my mother, my aunt, one grandmother, and my cousin. These are the only people who survived. So the war ended, and which was the most incredible. I mean, the first words of my memoir are, "I love America. If it weren't for the American Armed Forces, I wouldn't be here to tell you my story." Mm-hmm. Because America saved us. So at the end of the war, my aunt was brought to America by the brother who had gone ahead before the McCarran Act. He found the survivors and he sponsored my aunt, grandmother, and cousin. And then when my aunt got here, she got the rest of the family to sponsor us. So I came in 1947, settled in New York. We had $400 to our name. Yeah. 2 suitcases, and I became the American dream. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no way that in staying in France, even after the war, that I would ever have reached the places that I reached in America. So, but what makes me very sad, and one of the reasons why I'm so concentrating on universal basic income, is because the American dream, in my view, is dead. Children, I mean, young people now, after the group that survived the 2009, 2010 recession, is now, the group that is graduated during, was involved in education during the pandemic. The opportunities for them are just not the same because of many other things. And I'm not going to talk about this now because we're talking about my life.
Yeah.
Gisèle, can I ask?
Yeah, sure, of course. Please interrupt me at any time.
Yeah,
I can talk for hours on that.
Since you mentioned Ukraine and America, I guess let me just put two pieces together. Where in Ukraine was the family basically from? I mean, they may have been spread out, but what region? West, east, central? And then secondly, only at 11 years old, is there something that still, you mentioned a very sort of dramatic, the importance of the U.S. Armed Forces and the rest. When you were approaching, I assume, New York, was there something in those immediate days of your arrival that still stick with you? Because you were young, but it's such a dramatic situation. But Ukraine first, what region? Yes. And then secondly, the U.S. question.
So Odessa, in the the place, the port where there's all of this, right now, huge fighting, and a very small town near Kiev. Mm-hmm. That was my maternal side came from that small town, and my paternal side came from Odessa. The 2 things I remember, like a real memory from when I arrived in New York was at early in the morning, the ship going by the Statue of Liberty. We were all on deck. It was an incredible moment. And the first time I walked into a supermarket, and the way a supermarket looks, they look the same way then. I'd come from a country where there was rationing still, where I had spent 4 years barely eating. when the Germans occupied us, they requisitioned everything. I mean, we used to get an egg a week.
Yeah.
It was, I can still, visualize that moment when I walked into a supermarket with that profusion of food piled, in bins, and it was incredible, incredible.
And Giselle, your education was at public schools in New York?
Yes, so my first experience was one of the reasons why I internalized the need to transform education. So when we moved to New York, we joined my aunt, my grandmother, and my cousin, who lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the South Bronx, which was a ghetto. I mean, an African-American ghetto at the time. That's all they could afford. And so 5 of us lived in a one-bedroom apartment, where there was an alley between the 2 buildings, and people threw their garbage out, and it accumulated. I mean, it was a culture shock of the first order, as was going to PS2, the city zoo, which was the school that I was assigned to, which had been a hospital during the Civil War. So you can imagine the state of the building. I was one of 3 white kids in the class. It was, I didn't speak a word of English, of course. It was 6th grade, the 6th grade. And there was no teaching room, none. I mean, those children were being warehoused. That's what that was. They were playing ball with the little Spaldings, I'll always remember. I mean, they're reading comic books there.
Mm-hmm.
And at that moment, it was like, I mentioned in my book, it was like the movie The Snake Pit, when this woman finds herself in an asylum and she doesn't remember why. Mm-hmm. And I was in this situation that I couldn't come to grips with. So my mother got us out of there as soon as she could, which was about 10 months. And we moved to a small place in Manhattan, and I went to a good, solid school, Joan of Arc Junior High School. And then she remarried, and we moved to Forest Hills, and I went to Forest Hills High School, which was paradise, with like a small college, mm-hmm. with great fields and just wonderful place. Mm-hmm. So my American education got much better, but when I was 18 and when I graduated from high school, I got married, much to the despair of everybody. Because everybody wanted me to go to college, my parents and my counselors in school, but my late husband was in the Air Force, and I wanted to be with him, so we got married, and I went to live in Newfoundland for a year and a half.
Oh, I did not know that. Okay, yes. All right.
That was
you're a hockey fan.
Not at all. I'm not a fan of any sport at all. Mm-hmm. And so, that it was a very interesting place. Yeah. Especially being in the Air Force and, being in the milieu, we met people we would never in a million years have met otherwise, mm-hmm. which was the great thing about it, which is the great thing about the armed forces, is that it brings people together that would never meet otherwise. So filling in some blanks then, if necessary, how'd you get to San Francisco? So in the meantime, I started going to college when I was 32, which I went to Hunter College, which was walking distance from where I lived. So it was very easy to do that. Got involved in the revolution, the upheavals, when the school closed down for 3 months. In 1970 for a number of reasons, including, the whole Kent State thing and the revolution that was going on. But we settled in Manhattan, my late husband and I. We were social climbers. We were just barely, we were middle class, let's call it that. And we were, hobnobbing it because we spent part of the summer in East Hampton, which is a playground for the very rich. But we were, you know, I think that being French, I had a certain cachet, you know, and I also had a kind of a natural bent for understanding wines and food, and you know, this was part of my DNA. So it wasn't difficult to fit in at a level that was acceptable, you know, in terms of what we had to bring to the table, so to speak. But we were social climbing, and at one point, my late husband was made a partner in a startup service bureau where he had the operational capabilities, and the other partners had the money and the connections and were their salesmen. And because of that, he was able to, at one point, sell out. They sold out to American Express, and he was the equivalent. I mean, he was, his part of the sale was the equivalent of $3 million today. So he stopped working. He was 37 years old, and we retired essentially. I went to school. I got my PhD, and so there we were. He was, you know, a young man. And in the milieu of New York, you go into a cocktail party, the first thing they ask you is, what do you do? Then where do you live, and where do your children go to school? And those three questions are whether they're going to continue to talk to you, or whether you disappear from the face of the earth, as far as they're concerned, right? So it got to the point where, you know, it was very difficult. And we had very close friends, a group of close friends, but we lost. The fact that he wasn't working was making it difficult. And the fact that I was in another intellectual sphere altogether. I mean, I couldn't get involved in conversations with my friends anymore. You know, I was flying I was in political philosophy. So I was with my boys, I would call them, you know, and it stopped at Karl Marx. But going from, you know, pre-Plato to Karl Marx, those were not conversations I could have with my friends. So, and our respective parents moved to the West Coast because our respective sisters were there. So the pull was too strong. There's nothing holding us back in New York, so we moved to San Francisco.
Okay. Well, why don't we end part one there, and we're going to pick up in part two with the West Coast Gisèle Huff.
Okay.